Okay, I'm going to start with our next panel or table. First of all, thank you very much, Andrea, for this invitation. Although we're just starting, this is proving to be a real success. This is the type of discussions that I think we need, and we need a lot, especially when you have people from other universities and other places. So thanks, Andrea, and thanks everybody to be here. I'm going to present you our next speaker and our next commentator, though we all know who she is. But our next speaker is Professor Zachary Elkins. Zachary, first of all, welcome. Welcome to Mexico, to this institute. Zachary is an associate professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas. His research focuses on issues of democracy, institutional reform, research methods, and national identity, with an emphasis on cases in Latin America. His publications include The Endurance of National Constitutions, a publication that was mentioned by Professor Ginsburg during his presentation, and also Design by Diffusion, Constitutional Reform in Developing Democracies. I think this is at the present. He co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's really, really interesting. When I was yesterday reading the paper of Professor Elkins, let me see the project at the internet, and it's a really, really interesting work. One of those type of works that I don't know when are you thinking of putting an end on it, because it's like a forever and never going attempt. But anyway, congratulations on the project, and please welcome.
Thank you very much. Should I grab this?
Yes.
Well, it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thanks for Andrea and everybody else who organized this. Si alguien quiere hacer un comentario en español, pues está bien conmigo también. I really feel like this project, or the paper that I'm going to talk about, this very modest paper, is just sort of an appetizer in some ways for the main entree, which is this consolidation project, which I find I was almost just floored when I saw what you're doing. It's so ambitious and so important. And I think that everybody involved is going to have a lot to think about. But I think one of the things we can do is to put this in context and think about changes more broadly. And I think that's going to be helpful in the political project and getting the consolidation project off the ground, actually. So that's to say that what I'm going to talk about is not just pie in the sky, theoretical, academic stuff. I think it can be marshaled, and it is relevant for the project that you have underway here. Okay, what I'm going to say is actually highly related to some of the things that Tom was talking about. Tom and I are, in some sense, in the same band on this Comparative Constitution project. I often think of this as, sort of musical groups in some ways, and I have stepped away from the band to do the side project in the same way that Tom has stepped away and had done his side project without knowing. And I think we've both been on parallel paths and talking about similar things. So I'm going to hit some of the same themes that Tom has hit, and perhaps he and I will come back together in our band and produce this as a group project, and it'll be more cohesive. But I think it's nice in some ways that I'll hit some distinctive themes. Okay. I wrote this paper really as a festschrift for my advisor, David Collier, who is retiring, and his work is on critical junctures. He hadn't thought about it from the constitutional angle, but of course that's my interest. And the idea of critical junctures is a very short, abrupt, punctuated change, followed by a long period of stable equilibrium, and that's not what's going on in Mexico clearly with hyper-reformism. You can think maybe of the 1917 Constitution as an abrupt, perhaps revolutionary shock, followed by what it seems by lots of movement and not very much stasis. But I am going to focus on abrupt punctuated change, something that people see or perceive as going on in the Andes. But what I'm going to suggest is not clear to me and may not be clear to others is really how much change is going on. at least constitutionally, and to what extent. And I'm going to tie it back at the end to hyper-reformism. I feel like every paper I write is almost like some 16th century artist that's been commissioned by some benefactor, and so this paper was commissioned by the Colliers. Now I'm going to think about hyper-reformism and shift the paper in that way. Maybe at one point I'll write a paper all on my own without some benefactor telling me what to write, but we'll see. So just to start, one important fact that we need to know, this is a graphic produced by the New York Times with data from the Comparative Constitution Project that Ugo was talking about. And the point here, which is illegible, but it is beautiful, I think, is that there's a lot of constitutional change. The tall, dark bars are new constitutions, and that's going to become relevant in a second. And the smaller, dark bars are amendments. Think of it as hyper-reformism. This is organized by region, but in Western Europe, and especially here in Latin America, the point is that there's a lot of change, whether it be in terms of replacements or in terms of amendments. This is just kind of a basic historical fact that we're dealing with, and I think obviously the point of this conference, or one of the things that I'm going to talk about, is whether it matters, whether it comes in the form of an amendment or a replaced constitution. I think on their face, if we can shift to the Andes for a second, it's understandable why a lot of people think they see something new in the Andes. These are new constitutions that are part of what people are calling, I don't think very generously, the pink tide. They're Bolivarian constitutions which signal a left turn in Latin American politics. And so we see the rhetoric, but we don't know how it actually compares to real shift on the ground. And I think this gets to a point raised in the concept paper that Andrea and others, and I guess Tom, prepared for this conference, which is efficacy, which is change underneath the Constitution on the ground, however we want to think about it or measure it. Okay, so if you look at the Andes, I think the reason why people see radical change is for a couple of reasons. One, I'm thinking about three constitutions, by the way, the Bolivian, the Ecuadorian, and the Venezuelan. So in the case of Bolivia, people see this new plurinational constitution, which is reflected in the new name of the country, of course. And they see 36 official languages, some of which are extinct, as a real shift towards a multicultural constitution, and that seems like something new. You turn to Ecuador and you see some what appear to be innovations. Maybe they're along the margins, but they appear to be innovations, and I'm thinking of Pachamama, a well-known indigenous term for this idea of giving nature its own rights, which seems radical, seems different, and that's sort of one example of what is another set of new things in the Constitution. And then another idea which seems to pervade all three constitutions and really is at the core, I think, of the Bolivarian idea is this idea of, let's call it a fourth or even fifth branch of government. And so, of course, I'm thinking of the idea of direct democracy and these very, if you want, new avenues and forms of participation for citizens, which seems to be something new. We'll see if it really is or not. Okay, and I think to step back for a second, a lot of this rhetoric and a lot of this change, it's going on more generally in the political system of these three countries, but it's also going on, and this is very important for us, very centrally in the constitutions. That is, all three leaders of these countries were very committed to putting these changes right off the bat into their constitutions. So they don't see constitutions as some sort of mere reflection of things they're doing more generally through other means. Constitutions are the vehicle for enacting these changes. I have a quote in the paper, if you've read it, from Chavez, in which he uses his inaugural speech to say very clearly all these things are going to happen in the Constitution, señores, whether you like it or not. And I like, yeah. So that's important for us, I think, analytically, because I'm going to marshal data that Tom and I have put together to get a sense of whether these things are new. And it's relevant that we look at constitutions, because if not, we're subject to the claim, which seems reasonable in many contexts, that the constitutions are epiphenomenal and peripheral to what's really going on. Okay. So you can see the rest of these graphs. This is a chronology. By the way, this is a chronology that Tom and I put together in preparation for collecting our data. And what's involved here is trying to identify every single constitutional change in every single country for the last 200 years. So it's a mammoth historical undertaking, and we've identified what we think is every formal change to every country. But of course, we've missed some, and we have a list of. We've also found the text for each of these constitutional changes, the text associated with that change, with the exception of maybe 30, which I'm going to put on a sort of a most wanted list. We're still hunting for the constitutional text for only 30 constitutional changes out there. But in any event, that's sort of in some ways the backbone of our project, this chronology. Okay, so I'm a big fan of the radio show This American Life, which is always structured in terms of 3 acts. Act 1 is the revolution won't be written in fewer than 10,000 words. You can look at constitutions in a variety of ways. I've become, in the project that Tom and I have done, kind of in some ways a student of this genre, having read so many constitutions, and I appreciate many of the stylistic elements, and I think that's important because what's going on in this consolidation project is, in many ways, a point of style and not of substance. Your point in this project is that you're not changing the substance in any way, you're just changing the style. So what better way to think about style than to think about word count? We all care about that as authors. Often it's our preoccupation. But I think it also is a really good reflection of what's going on in the Constitution. The Bolivarians have very ambitious plans to change many aspects of things. These ambitious plans cannot be constrained to a few words. If they're going to change what they want to change, it's going to take a lot of words. So this is a very valid and I think reliable measure of what's going on. It's also a theme that plays into what this consolidation project. The number of words is in many ways a summary of what's going on in your project. So let's take a look at that. All I've done here is to overlay a histogram, if you want to flip it on its side. This is on the left panel are the first constitutions for each of the Latin American countries, and on the right are the most recent constitutions for these countries. It's just to sort of measure central tendency, but you get a sense of the distribution as well. Early constitutions are all pretty short, coming in well under 20,000 words. The more recent ones are much longer. Brazil is there at the top. But you also see Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela in the top 5. They're big constitutions compared to recent constitutions of other Latin America. I know you can't read those labels, so just take my word for it. But the Bolivarian constitutions are big, especially compared to their historically and to contemporary. So the lines are, yes, the lines, it's two standard deviations away from the mean, to give you a sense of the distribution. So I apologize for this, but I actually included this graph when I presented this at the Festschrift for the Colliers, and their big book is Shaping the Political Arena. And I say big because it is 400,000 words. And so just if you want a reference point, it's fun to think about constitutions and how they vary in terms of length, but let's look at a mammoth political science tome, like the Shaping the Political Arena, which is at the top there. For better or for worse, there are fewer words than that. So the question is here on these three Bolivarian constitutions, if we were to look simply at word count, do they mark an abrupt shift? And they appear to. This is every single constitution, new constitution, and again, I'm going to come back to that, in Venezuela for the last 200 years, and their length. And if, in fact, the Venezuelan constitution is radically different, it should be much different in length from the others. And in fact, it is. You can see it's well above the regression line. All constitutions are getting marginally bigger, not approaching shaping the political arena, but they're getting bigger. But the new one is much bigger, twice as big as the last one and 3 times as big as the earlier ones. And the same for Ecuador, much bigger, much longer. It seems like they are packing in a lot of their hopes, dreams, and aspirations into these constitutions. Pasquale? Thank you. I like having you say right after each thing I say. Please continue on that. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Wrong. Bolivia is the same, much bigger, maybe even more extreme than the others. I think Tom and I are missing one Bolivian constitution, which is on our most wanted list. So if you can hunt that down, let us know. Just to get some summary sense of what's going on here, just to have a regression here in which I'm predicting the number of words in a constitution. And we saw that in general, this is 674 constitutions. We have some 900 or so in the full data set, but I have 674 in the analysis here. And in general, you can see the top coefficient is saying every year you get about 90 words added to a constitution on average. The Bolivarian constitutions, compared to all others, are 23,000. This is controlling for year, which is the most important thing since everything's creeping up. But the Bolivarian constitutions are distinct from all others, coming in at 23,000 words more, sizable difference. Shaping the political arena, I think this is the first time that the Collier's book has been included in a regression, and its regression coefficient, they were very pleased to have their book having a regression coefficient, 78,000 more. Act 2. So these are big constitutions. Something borrowed, something new. How new are these things? And my approach to this is similar to what Tom was doing to some degree, and that is to look at these changes. And what I've done here is created a measure of similarity between any two constitutions, and their measurement issues figure really prominently in this paper. There are a number of questions. One is, what are the inputs into this measure of similarity? I've constructed two. One is a measure of inventory similarity, which is across about 70 different items, inventory items. Is that item in the Constitution, 1 or a 0? Things like, is there a provision for the central bank, et cetera, et cetera. And then the idea is to see whether any two constitutions include the same items. Then there's a measure of right similarity. Do they include or exclude the same rights? Anyway, so we can put those aside, but questions are welcome on that. This is a figure looking at just similarity to the preceding constitution in Venezuela. That is, this measure ranges from 0 to 1 across all constitutions. So imagine a lot of dyads comparing the U.S. to Sri Lanka and everything in between. And the average, I've just put that in there. That's that line going across at 6.64. That's the average across all dyads, just to give you a reference point. And then you can see you'd expect constitutions from the same country to be similar to other constitutions in that series. And in fact, they are. They're all above that line for the most part. And what these triangles are is the similarity between that constitution and its predecessor. So anything close to 1, which is the extreme version, that's almost the same constitution. So you can see in the early 1900s or so, they wrote a lot of constitutions that were essentially replicas of one another. But in terms of rights, yes, in terms of rights. Inventory 1 is similar but different, but reflects the constitutions that are high, that are similar to the predecessors on this, are also similar to the predecessors on inventory generally. But there's some, there are the ones that lower in the figure are the sort of the revolutionary ones, the different ones. The most recent Constitution is the lowest, and strikingly, if we think about that reference point, it's just as similar to its predecessor as is any constitution, the average constitution in the data set. So like, this is the average across, all these country dyads, everything from like, St. Lucia compared to Russia. The average of those is 0.64. The Venezuelan constitution, this is really striking, is just as similar to its predecessor as the average across all these. So there's really something new compared to its last constitution, really something new. And this is a regression. You might be curious which factors, these are variables that indicate elements of any two dyad, whether they're in what era they were written. That's the difference in years between any two constitutions, and whether they're from the same region, same country. Remember, we've got a lot of constitutions, especially from the Dominican Republic and Haiti, that have a lot of constitutions in this data set. In fact, Dominican Republic and Haiti account for 1/10 of the constitutions in our data set. That's the place to, Island of Hispaniola is the place to go to study constitutions. Thank you. And so the point here is, you might be curious what things predict similarity, just to put the previous finding in context. Okay. A third element here is whether the Bolivarian constitutions are similar to one another. We know that they're radically different from their predecessors, but are they similar to one another? What I've done here is I have a regression for each country. I don't know why I didn't pool them together, but this is a regression for each country. So the end is the Bolivian constitution compared to all others in the world in that first column, the Venezuelan constitution compared to all others in the world, the Ecuadorian compared to all others. And then the question is, if we just, you see the sort of the same variables in terms of same country, same region, et cetera. One note is that in Bolivia, the constitutions don't appear to be that much similar to one another than they are to any other country in the world, which is strange. But I want to focus your attention on the coefficient for Bolivarian. If you're a Bolivarian constitution, two constitutions that are both Bolivarian are 13 points more similar. And remember, this dependent variable ranges from 0 to 1, and a 13-point difference is really big. I think the standard deviation in that measure is maybe 6 or 7, so it's a really big shift if you're Bolivar. They are pretty similar to one another, in other words, these Bolivarian constitutions. Okay, what really matters is Mexico, right? Enough of the Andes. Who cares about the Andes? Let's start talking about Mexico. Is that like a right or a wrong? Yeah. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about here today? I think a couple things. I want to come back to something I said earlier, which is these are new constitutions. And by that, I mean they've gone outside the amendment procedure and scrapped the old constitution and rewritten something. So that's a different way of changing the Constitution from the sort of intra-system changes that we're concerned about here in Mexico in hyper-reformism. But maybe it's the case that it doesn't matter. Like say we have a 1917 Constitution that's been amended many times. Or on the other hand, say we have constitutions like those in the Andes which are just rewritten. Maybe it doesn't matter that we're scrapping a whole constitution, rewriting it, or changing it from within the system. Maybe if they're enacting substantive changes and updating them, maybe it doesn't matter. And perhaps it's almost this reification to say, okay, a new constitution is very different from an amendment of a constitution. They are just constitutional changes, and maybe it's just sort of this conceptual category, which is in the end meaningless. I don't know. There are a couple. I think we need to think about this. Nominally, it's a big difference in some ways that it's a new constitution as opposed to a change. And that perception probably matters to people in the country. If you think you're still working under the 1917 Constitution, that might be meaningful as opposed to thinking that you're in this new revolutionary era with a new constitution. That might be meaningful to people. It might be meaningful to legislators. And I think we want to think through that as we think about this consolidation exercise. There might be real value in just in restyling and retooling the Mexican Constitution in a way that we stay within the 1917 framework. I think the other thing to talk about here has to do with efficacy, does it really matter in terms of real shifts on the ground that we're seeing, these constitutional shifts? So what I've noticed is that people who look at democracy and score democracy seem to have now scored the Bolivarian constitutions low in terms of democracy. In some sense, Freedom House lists Venezuela as its sort of top 5 offender of democracy, or whatever they have in their list. And so we see shifts that people are noticing in terms of societal and other aspects of democracy, which are corresponding to shifts at the constitutional level. And I think that's something to take into account, and that's something to push forward here. And if I could say one final thing, this might anticipate some of Andrea's comments, is it's one thing just to look at these bird's eye view broad changes that I'm looking at here, but really in the end what we might be concerned about is changes where? Are they changes at the core of the Constitution? Are they changes, many of us are familiar with sort of an argument these days that what really matters in the Andes is whether there's changes in the engine room. I'm talking about as opposed to, or like there's talk that maybe they're adding social rights and Pachamama and these sorts of things, but if the structural changes with respect to executive and legislative relations is not changing, then there's no real change. And that's, I think, the next move to make in this paper is to start looking at those dimensions and see if we're seeing changes in those areas. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Elkins. And now it's turn to Andrea. I'm not going to say anything because you all know her. She's our host, the coordinator of this event. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll be really brief because we don't have much time, and I want you to hear it. So I have, regarding, so of course scope is one of the things we want to capture when we study constitutional change. So, and SAC presents in this paper 2 measures to capture scope. These measures are basically done through what he called inventory similarity, and so I have some concerns with the first measure, but I will go directly to the second one because regarding the first measure, I just was wondering, because you don't make clear in the paper what exactly do you think your measure captures about scope, in the sense that, of course, as you say, it is very broad. So you would take general topics and see whether this inventory, there is coincidence in this inventory. So what part of scope are you capturing? And it seems to me that the claim you want to do, but I'm not sure if that's the claim, that the relation between inventory similarity and scope of constitutional change is mainly that it is not necessary, but it's sufficient. In the sense that when you have great shifts in inventory, you are witnessing great changes in scope. So that your measure, there will be a lot of changes that will not be significant changes that won't be captured by that, as you were saying, but that if you have these changes in scope, then you can be certain that there are changes in scope. I don't know if that's part of what you are, the idea. So with regard to that measure. I will really briefly focus on similarity of rights. That is the second measure. So this measure is calculated by summing the number of rights which any 2 constitution coincide. That is the number of rights that both omit or include, and you divide it by the 70 rights you have. So the first concern I have is that this measure doesn't capture, as you were saying, a lot of important things. So we don't think that changes in every right are the same. That we think that some rights weight more and have more consequences. So if you change, for instance, thinking about Schumpeter, if you change the right to vote active and passive. You change association, and you change freedom of expression. That is a huge change. While if you change some of the rights that you have in the Constitution project, for instance, the right to rest and leisure, the right to academic freedom, the right to a competitive marketplace, and the right to the benefits of science, then the change wouldn't be as high. So you would have...
You're saying that as an academic?
I mean, yeah, freedom of expression seems to me more... But, I mean, the way that it's in the Constitution, I mean, I do believe that there are certain changes that weight more and that you need to include that. And here maybe you would like to think about types of rights, because I don't, and this might help to think how you could include some of this. So the second question, I will try to link with the discussion we'll have later on Mexico too, is regarding one of the greatest changes in scope we have had. Well, what everyone considers is a huge change in scope, that is a 2011 constitutional reform in human rights. So I was wondering, as you know, this is a change in an article that says that Mexico now recognizes all the rights listed in treaties. So now that, how would you incorporate this type of changes in your right similarity? Because what we get as a reform is just the incrementation by rights in a really, the scope is huge. So would you, if you could, and whether you would incorporate it or not? So, and then I want to close really fastly, because I want everyone to have a little bit the chance of talking three comments on Mexico Hyper-Reformism. First, I know that your constitution focuses on substitution, not an amendment, but I think it will be wonderful to use your measures and compare the Mexican Constitution of 1917 in its original form to the one we have today. And my feeling is, because of the way you construe the measures, is that you would have two completely different constitutions. And so, in a way, that helps. That is the case because of our hyper-reformism. But I think, and of course, to approach constitutional amendments, you would need to incorporate a different approach. I also was wondering that I think it would be interesting, and I was trying to think. I was asking what you would think of applying your measures to the project, to Hector's and Diego's project. Because, so I don't know, I was curious, how do you deal with organic laws? Do you take it as part of the Constitution, or do you take it as different, as separate from the Constitution? Because if you don't take it as part of the constitutional text, then what we would have is a radical change in scope according to your measures, while Hector and Diego think that that's not so much the case. So, and finally, I also found, and this is really interesting to think of the relation between the scope of the change, and that Mexico has undergone, and the scope of those changes. I think, I mean, at least prima facie, following your approach, we could differentiate two types of changes. Changes, on the one hand, amendments that have implied changes on what you call constitutional topics, like the introduction of the Commission of Human Rights, and on the other hand, changes in what you call subtopic level, that will be more on the changing some of the functions. So it seems that inventory transformation incorporates new parts to the constitutional machinery, and that has happened a lot in our constitution. And prima facie, we could pose that these changes require constitutional craft, because what you are actually doing is adding a complete new a complete new body, constitutional body, to the Constitution. So that, in that sense, your measurement captures when complete new organizations are like, is a new piece to the machinery, to the constitutional machinery. This creates, and I think it's interesting because this needs, in order to not create inconsistencies, the type of inconsistencies we will talk later today, it needs a type of care that is different from the type of care that you need on the types you. So in that sense, the different kinds of changes regarding to scope, I think require different approaches to constitutional change, and also might be more prone to certain types of inefficacies. So in particular, I think that these system inconsistencies and problems of coordination of different institutions might be brought by these huge scope changes following your measures.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it, mainly.
Great. Okay, thanks, Andrea.
Okay, let's start with our questions and commentaries. Please, Professor.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, why so many constitutions in Latin America? I only know one parallel case, which is France. As you know, well, 16 compared with the United States, even with Italy. Italy had a constitution for 1 century. And I think that there are two possible reasons. One is what we were saying before with John. So if there is no social equilibrium, the constitution is unstable, inevitably. So in France, for 1 century, the effect of the revolution were not stabilized. We had to wait to the Third Republic. Now, that's a possibility, but there is another possibility I want to ask you. It seems to me that in Latin America, in general, more than writing what I would call a constitution, they produce a manifesto. Mm-hmm. A political actor wins a civil war or an election, and they packed in they freeze. They hope to freeze in the constitution, in the rigid constitution, their manifesto. But then there is another coup, and they cannot use the same constitution. A constitution has to be able to be used by the order, the minority, which in a democracy at least becomes a majority. My second question is then, Mexico is a surprising exception. For 1 century, they never changed the constitution. Now, either the system were stable, or more probably the system was controlled for a long time by one single political actor, able to modify the constitution without changing it, because, I mean, they controlled the supermajority. Now comes the most tricky question. Why they continued to change the constitution and even increase the number of amendments when the system moved from a monopolistic actor to a pluralistic actor, where you need the agreement of the opposition? Then I really don't understand, and I find that fascinating. I don't understand things which I find fascinating in general. So thank you.
Would you like to answer immediately?
And then I have lots of things for Andrea. Well, should we take both of these?
Yeah, we will discuss these
Okay,
things also later on.
Marcus, it's ringing in my ears. I mean, and this is a big topic for many at the conferences, the difference between behavior in Mexico compared to other countries. But yeah, Latin America with a lot of constitutions. Yeah. I think I agree with you that in many ways it can become a manifesto to signify real change, and sometimes even a vanity project of the president who comes into power. And who wouldn't want to write their own constitution once they become president? What a great thing, right? And so, and once that becomes, there's some momentum and a culture takes hold that's customary, then yes, I think it's also the case that some of these things are the product of excessive executive ambition.
Right.
It is the case that a lot of constitutions get changed because you want to change term limits and allow yourself a new term. And that becomes a vehicle. It seems really unseemly to write an entire new constitution only to give yourself another term, but it does happen. So I think there's I'm going to call those all part of sort of a vanity project. Tom and I have in our book sort of some reasons why within the text we think these things get replaced more often than others. And I won't go into too much detail there because I want to sell more books on there.
Yeah.
But I think that parts of the text, in particular the specificity of the text and the amendment ease of the text, play into that very much. Can I take a few of Andrea's points? There's so many, so I'll talk to these afterwards. So
Vanity Project is wonderful.
Okay, good.
I like it.
I just thought about it. So just in the area of rights, so the 2011 reform in Mexico to formally integrate and incorporate the rights that are enshrined in the treaties to which it's a signatory. To me, one question is whether that's the same as something you might write for yourself into your constitution more formally and more directly. I think there might be a difference. And this gets, Tom and I have done some writing about what we call substitutes, duplicates, and complements. Probably others use those same terms as well. But it does seem like if you're a country, you've written a constitution, and you're already subject to the same set of laws at a higher level, at a supranational level, perhaps in terms of treaty, there is a question of whether you want to write those same rights into your constitution and reinforce them, even though it seems like you're simply duplicating these treaties you're already signed on to. But I think it does mean something to have it in customary law. All those treaties say, now that let's take the ICCPR, your signatory, you have to now implement that in your domestic law. So I think it matters whether it's written in the national constitution or not. And I think that this 2011 change, I think they can't just say that we're integrating these formally. You have to actually put them in, I would think. So let's stay on rights for a second. Some rights are more important than others. And you've now subordinated all of these rights to academic freedom and that we all hold so dearly, but perhaps they are less important than these other rights. One thing, I hate to reference another project that Tom and I are doing, but one thing we're doing is looking at the conceptualization of rights, and we've certainly found that if you look at rights that have been enshrined in constitutions over the last 200 years, one thing you find is this increased specification. That is, obviously early constitutions will think about rights in a very general sense, and maybe just equality for all and non-discrimination, but then obviously there's a tendency to specify the groups that deserve non-discrimination. And I think, and I don't know if this is for a fact, but I think Bolivia has more groups listed who are entitled to non-discrimination than any other constitution in the world. I mean, it's something about 15 groups. I'm sure more groups will be added on, but I think in general, in terms of the rights, there is increased specification. I think that what that means in part is that some are more important than others. Maybe the right to dignity, maybe the right to expression, maybe the right to life. Maybe these are more core and more central and matter more, and we should be reflecting that in the measure of rights. And maybe rights like right to the free development of one's personality, which is my personal favorite. Maybe that's not as important. I don't know exactly what it means, but it is a cool right.
No, it's really nice. So, yeah, let's open so that because we don't have.
Well, it's Professor Ferjan and then Pablo. Two by two.
Okay.
So I have a suggestion that follows one of Andrea's suggestions. She said compare Mexico 1917 to Mexico today.
Yeah.
But this is maybe since you said in response to Pasquale that you regard some of these intermediate constitutions in what became the Bolivarian republics as sometimes vanity projects, and so you're sort of demoting them from real. Why don't you do the same thing for Mexico in the other direction? The following. So, for example, whenever there was a new constitution in one of the Bolivarian republics, just freeze the Mexico of that moment. You see, and then call that a new constitution. It's a moment. So you'll have a whole bunch of places where you freeze the Mexican constitution. Then you do exactly the same graph that you have for the Bolivarian ones. Look at it. Like, I mean, they're going to be, because we know of
Mexico, would I freeze it for every single change, though?
Well, you could
do.
You could have various ways. You could say, we'll look at when there's, like, you could do it any number of ways. Just freeze it. So let's freeze it in the following way. So there's the same number of quasi-constitutions in Mexico as there are in Bolivia or Venezuela or Ecuador, whatever you want. But the point is, at the same moment in time. So this cuts across Mexican hyper-reformism. So there's going to be a lot of change. And then you calculate your similarity measures adjacently. Do exactly the same calculation. What does it look like? So I'm sure it's going to look different in some ways, but it may look a lot more similar than you might intuit. Now, I admit that any way you do that is a little bit arbitrary, so do it more than one way. You can find out how robust that would be. So that's one comment to make as comparable as possible the Mexican case to the Bolivarian cases. And it seems like that would be a valid exercise even if you didn't publish it. But if it was enlightening, it might be worth actually publishing it. So because it would allow you to do comparative work in a kind of counterfactual way that might be enlightening, and it would allow you to ask these questions about what you're calling vanity projects over there. And in Mexico, you don't have those things exactly. So that's one comment. The second comment is that the issue of changing a constitution and amending a constitution is a political issue every place, not just here. So for example, in India, in the response to the Gandhi dictatorships, there was saying, well, this part of the constitution is entrenched. You can't change this. This other part you can amend. The Germany from the beginning can't change this part. The United States, the provisions having to do with the Senate, well, you could change it, but under a very different procedure. Like the state has to agree. So we have this concept of what's an amendable aspect of the Constitution and what isn't. So it seems like that's something that's in play here also. And it seems like, so for example, in Mexico, it seems like there's no such distinction. Maybe there is. Maybe I don't know what it is. But in other words, anything seems to be amendable in Mexico. But de facto in the Bolivarian cases, it looks like, well, if you want to make any change at all, you might as well change the Constitution. So it looks like everything has to be a matter of change, and almost nothing's amendable. But maybe that's not true. But so the question is, since it's always a political issue, since the idea of entrenching is a political decision which is always contentious, and which is often substantively important, you might use your data here to get a handle on those decisions, because it seems to be a difference between the Bolivarian way of doing things and the Mexican way of doing things.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to elaborate on a point that Andrea made on the inclusion of new machinery or new pieces in the constitutional machinery and its effects in the scope and length of constitutions. But it's also related with a comment from Julio on the last panel on the patterns of amendment and the relevance of the distinction between the dogmatic part of the Constitution and the organic part of the Constitution, which I think is really relevant on capturing the patterns of amendment, because between the dogmatic part of the Constitution that deals with rights and the organic part of the Constitution that is related with the political game in the traditional conception of the organic part, there is a large part of the constitutions, or at least of the constitutional provisions that refer to the design and empowering of government, which is not part, or at least is not completely part of the political game, but it's also it's related with the realization or production of rights, the conditions for rights. That part of the Constitution entangles public policy in the Constitution. I mean, the public policy gets entangled in the constitutional provisions, and that's really relevant in terms of what kind of institutional change or new pieces of the machinery are included in the Constitution. There is a large part of provisions that are related on the design of new, or if not new, at least of different bodies that have in charge the execution of public policy. That is not part of the political game, that are not part of the traditional distinction between judiciary, legislative, and the executive power, but that are part of the executive branch of government. Those provisions are related with institutions that have in charge the administration of national resources, protection of environment, the corruption, control of corruption, and all that kinds of things of transparency and so on. Economic policy, central banking, taxation, budgeting, revenue, control of spending, of spending different branches of government, etc. In the case of Mexico, competition, telecommunications, etc. Those are things that are in the Mexican Constitution with one with certain design or color, but also in the Bolivarian constitutions. And this is a large part of the Constitution. And I think that we have to, in order to explain both the patterns of amendment and the scope and the length, 400,000 words, well, large part of it's related with this new idea of the constitutional domain in Latin America, at least.
Okay. All yours.
Okay. Well, just in order, John, I like your idea of abstracting from this, in some ways, arbitrary label of a new constitution versus amendment, and just really seeing whether the change is meaningful or not, regardless of what we call it, and taking some snapshots and comparing them. I think it gets to this question, which I think is so critical, about whether it really matters whether we're making inter-system changes versus intra-system changes. And it could be that it doesn't matter, and I think that'd be a good way to do that analysis. The point you made about whether core parts of the Constitution are being touched or not, whether they're in some ways implicitly unamendable parts of the Constitution that just kind of remain and by some sort of tacit agreement are not touched. That's a really interesting thing to explore, and I think we should do that. So the question would be, okay, are there some core elements that remain that seem sacred? I think there are two reasons why maybe those things wouldn't be changed. One is that they're sacred because they're so core to, in some ways, the political identity of the Constitution that you couldn't possibly change it without having something really new. But also, in the sense of the hyper-reformism, another reason why you can't touch those really core things is they would then, they interact with so many other aspects of the Constitution, and they're so highly related. So if you change, for example, the system of executive legislative relations from presidentialism to parliamentarism, that seems like that would rock the boat for so many other aspects of the Constitution that you couldn't possibly do that without doing something new. And so I think implicitly that's what's going on. If we're going to touch a core part of the Constitution, we're going to do a new Constitution. If not, we're going to tinker around the edges. That's what right. So, but be good to test that and see whether there's some intra-systemic changes that are really revolutionary in terms of adopting new legislative relations or something like that. Just some thoughts. So Pablo, on your the idea of new machinery, it does. It seems to me that a lot of the new machinery is public policy elements tacked on. And then, so what does that mean? I guess one question is, should they be tacked on? Is the Constitution the place to put those very specific public policy elements? I mean, there's a lot of scholars in Brazil now who are reacting really negatively to that practice and saying, we really shouldn't be doing this. Let's preserve the Constitution for core, abstract, general principles, and then maintain some fine line, as I'm hearing in the hyper-reformism project here, between, say, organic law or institutional acts on the one hand, constitutions on the other, and then maybe as a third thing, the policy that is implied by those things. And I think in terms of style, making that division makes total and utter sense. And I think one of the reasons, this is going back to Pasquale's question about why to explain hyper-reformism within the system, is that if you have that much public policy in there, you're going to have change. You're building in necessary change if you're going to be that specific in your public policy things that are entangled. Okay, just on the organic law, you had a point of information, Andre, about whether we actually include those things as constitutions. We generally don't, unless they touch what we consider to be a core aspect of the Constitution. So if a country adopts an organic law or an institutional act which radically shifts the core elements of a constitution, then we include that as part of a constitution. But otherwise, we don't. Mostly as a matter of convenience, it's enough for us to collect all these constitutions without also collecting the organic laws.
And myself.
Thank you. So a very small point going back to the difference or lack of between amending a constitution or enacting a whole new one. So I think in the case of at least in the case of the Bolivarian constitutions, the new constitution was important because it signaled like a break with the past. But it's, on one dimension that's a symbolic importance. But I think very importantly that it also played a political function. And a decision by the so-called plurinational Constitutional Court of Bolivia comes to mind when Evo Morales wanted to be re-elected for a third time. So he cited the new constitution. The new constitution had a transitional clause saying that the first periods, the one he was serving when the constitution was amended, was to be counted as the first period. But he still went to court. And the court said, of course you can run again because this is a new regime. This is a new constitution and of a kind of a revolutionary nature, right? So of course you're allowed to run for another time. And now he's running for a fourth. So, and I think an amendment wouldn't have been enough. You needed something entirely new, right? A new constitution. So it's not only the symbolic nature, it's something else.
I have a comment. Tenemos tiempo, ¿no? Okay, very, very, very fast. I'm really concerned with your conclusions. I acknowledge that it is a work in progress, but when you touch the concept aspirational model, it comes to my mind something similar maybe to what Pablo was also saying. What are we talking about when we talk about constitutions? Are we talking about the same object? Because when we start talking about an aspirational constitution, it seems to me that maybe we're talking about something else than a true normative instrument in a country. And we're used to do that. In Mexico specifically, we love to have aspirational norms at the highest level for political and legitimation purposes. So today is a very symbolic day because today I think that the maybe only remaining true opposite movement in Mexico is getting his registry as a national president of the movement, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that among many other things now he has an announcement in radio that he's saying that if we come to power, every Mexican is going to have a job. Because like Roosevelt in the US, this is possible. And I'm just imagining if this guy comes to power, we're going to have another Bolivarian, maybe with another name, revolution in our country, trying to get this type of models in the supreme norm of the country. And maybe we're talking about different things, all mixing the same idea of the Constitution. I know this is going deeper to your data, but I think it was important.
Yeah. Do I have time to respond quickly to these? Okay. So, Hugo, I want to think more about this and hear from you a little bit more about the idea of the aspirational constitution. In some sense, you'd expect this from any constitution, that it would be aspirational, right? And maybe there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if everybody's on board with the goals. Introducing a new Bolivarian idea into the Mexican Constitution, in some sense, seems like it would be consistent with some of the goals of the revolutionary founders in 1917 and maybe following through on what they're trying to do more broadly. Maybe because we now associate that with a project which people aren't really on board with, maybe not. And so in some ways it's about the framing, I think, and how those things are put forth. I think back to FDR's famous speech in, I believe it was 1944, when he said, listen, we now need to win the war at home. And we have this project of social and economic rights, and he's really proposing a second Bill of Rights. He wasn't suggesting that they be incorporated in the Constitution, but he really was suggesting that we have a right to health and a right to housing and a right to work, and these things, pretty radical, pretty revolutionary, which reminds me a little bit of this, although this is coming from, maybe sort of a more central player. But I don't know. I mean, when I think about how that would be adopted in the amendment procedure for the Mexican Constitution, getting through both houses in a supermajority and then half the states, it seems like if it were that, a revolutionary Bolivarian project would be hard to get through that process, even if you're part of a coalition ruling. I don't know. I guess it's an institutional question. Just really quickly, well, I want to talk more about this amendment versus no. I think your ideas on that it jive exactly with what I have in mind on that, and so we'll talk more at the break. And yeah, I guess that's all I have here.
Okay. Well, it seems that it's time for a brief
Very
break,
brief.
2 minutes for a change, and then we have the next.